Good morning. My name is Lauren Mora, and I am a survey analyst at the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to our virtual program today featuring findings from the latest PPIC statewide survey on Californians and their government. This fund is supported with funding from the PPIC Business Council and the PPIC Golden State Society. The survey was supported with funding from the RJR and Francis F. Miller Foundation. For today's program, I will present some key findings from the survey and then turn to questions from the audience. If you have a question, please send it along with your name and organization to the email address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. As a reminder, PPIC is a public charity that does not take or support positions on any ballot measures or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose political parties or candidates for public office. And now on to the presentation. And if you give me a moment while I share my screen, just one second. So before I begin, I would like to acknowledge my co-authors on this report, which include Survey Director Mark Baldassare, Associate Survey Director and Research Fellow Dean Bonner, and Survey Analyst Deja Thomas. I would also like to acknowledge and thank our funders for this survey, the RJR and Francis F. Miller Foundation, because without their generous support, this work would not be possible. This survey is part of our Californians and Their Government series, which is now in its 28th year. And the survey has covered numerous local, state, international issues since 1998. And the mission of the PPIC statewide survey is to provide timely, relevant, nonpartisan data on political, social, and economic opinions. This particular survey was fielded February 3rd through the 11th using the Ipsos Knowledge Panel. Interviews were conducted in either English or Spanish, depending on the respondent's preference. And our sample includes 1,657 adults, and of that, we have identified 1,049 likely voters. The margin of error is 3.1% for adults and 3.9% for likely voters. Now to dive into some findings. Oh, sorry. Sorry about this, everyone. Okay, to dive into some findings. Sorry, y'all. Let's dive into some findings. California likely voters are now closely divided between 5 candidates for the top 2 governors primary. They include Steve Hilton, Katie Porter, Chad Bianco, Eric Swalwell, and Tom Steyer. All other candidates each have 5% or less support, and 10% of likely voters are undecided. Among Republicans, 4 in 10 support Hilton, and about 3 in 10 support Bianco. Among Democrats, about 2 in 10 support Porter and Swalwell, while 14% support Steyer. And independents are very loosely divided in who they support. Overall, 61% of likely voters say they are satisfied with their candidate choices for the governor's race. And similarly, 6 in 10 candidates say that their position on affordability and cost of living are very important in determining who to vote for governor. So on to looking forward to the House races later this year. I'm so sorry for these technical difficulties, everyone. Looking forward to the House races later this year. California likely voters choose the Democratic candidate over the Republican candidate by a wide margin. And partisans overwhelmingly support their party's candidate, while a majority of independents would vote for the Democratic candidate. 38% of likely voters say they are very or extremely enthusiastic about voting for Congress this year, while 3 in 10 are somewhat enthusiastic, and about a third are not too or not at all enthusiastic. 56% of likely voters say the candidate's positions on affordability are very important in determining who to vote for in the House race. On another topic, we did ask about the state budget. As announced in January, Governor Newsom proposed a budget plan for the next fiscal year that includes $248.3 billion in general funding spending. And after reading a short summary of the budget proposal, about 6 in 10 Californians are in favor and about a third oppose. A wide partisan divide does exist on the budget. 86% of Democrats favor, and additionally, over half of independents are in favor, while about 3 in 4 Republicans are opposed of this plan. And notably, half or more across regions and demographic groups favor the budget plan. We asked some specifics regarding the budget, and a majority of adults and likely voters do favor the state using its own funds to help offset the federal cuts to health and social services that were included in the federal One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Moving on, we asked respondents to choose from a list what they thought was the most important issue for the governor and legislature to work on in 2026. And California adults and likely voters both named the cost of living and economic conditions as the top issue. This is followed by housing issues and then state budget and spending issues. And cost of living was by far the top issue chosen across parties, regions, and demographic groups. So moving on to some state of the state questions, majorities of California adults and likely voters think that things in the state are generally headed in the wrong direction. About 7 in 10 Democrats say the state is going in the right direction, but conversely, 9 in 10 Republicans and 6 in 10 independents say it is headed in the wrong direction. And this all comes at a time when 7 in 10 adults and likely voters expect bad economic times over the next year. About a half approve of the job Gavin Newsom is doing as governor. 46% approve of the job the legislature is doing. And 56% think the governor and legislature will be able to work together to accomplish a lot over the next year. We also had the size of government that respondents would prefer, and a majority of adults and likely voters say that they would prefer to pay lower taxes and have a state government that provides fewer services, rather than paying higher taxes with a state government with more services. Across regions and demographic groups, Californians do prefer the less taxes, fewer services government, but notably, governments would prefer the opposite. Relatedly, about 7 in 10 Californians say they do feel like they pay much more or somewhat more in state and local taxes than they should. And additionally, 6 in 10 say our present state and local tax system is either not too fair or not at all fair. Moving on to some personal questions. Most Californians feel that their income is not keeping up with inflation. And this feeling is present in about 2 in 3 or more across demographic groups, including strong majorities across all income groups. Furthermore, about 4 in 10 Californians say they are very or somewhat concerned about having enough money to pay for their rent or mortgage. Across regions, Inland Empire residents are the most worried about this, while San Francisco Bay Area residents are the least concerned. And notably, renters are about twice as likely as homeowners to be worried about paying for housing. So moving on to state of the nation, we also asked respondents to choose from a list that they believe to be the most pressing pressing problem facing the US today. A little over a third of Californians chose political extremism or threats to democracy as the most important problem facing the US today. The share who chose political extremism has increased slightly from a year ago and significantly since October 2024, before the last presidential election. Today, additionally, about 2 in 10 adults choose economic conditions, including jobs and unemployment, and 14% chose immigration. And to give an overview about how Californians feel about the state of the nation, 77% say that the nation is headed in the wrong direction. 72% expect bad financial times over the next year, and only 1 in 4 approve of Donald Trump, and only 1 in 5 approve of the US Congress. About a quarter think President Trump and the US Congress will be able to come together to accomplish a lot over the next year. So moving on, we asked some questions about the US Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. And 6 in 10 adults and likely voters say that ICE operations are currently making communities less safe. About 2 in 10 adults and a quarter of likely voters say more safe, and 2 in 10 or fewer say it does not change either way. This all comes at a time when 3 in 4 Californians disapprove of the job that ICE is doing, And this includes 97% of Democrats and 76% of independents. Conversely, 64% of Republicans do approve of ICE. Two or three or more across regions and demographic groups do disapprove of the job ICE is doing. Relatedly, about 6 in 10 adults and likely voters somewhat or strongly approve of the recent protest against ICE actions. A majority is across regions and demographic groups to approve of these protests. Moving on to some findings about healthcare costs. About 3 in 4 adults opposed to the cuts to Medicaid that are included in the Big Beautiful Bill Act. Partisans are divided on this issue, but 2 in 3 or more across demographic groups and regional groups are at least somewhat opposed to the Medicaid cuts in the Big Beautiful Bill. So that being said, majorities of adults and likely voters do expect healthcare costs for them and their families to become less affordable in the next year. About 4 in 10 say it'll be about the same, and very few expect healthcare to become more affordable. And half or more across demographic groups and the state's major regions do expect healthcare costs to be less affordable. So this is just an overview of what our survey covered. Our survey covered a few other topics as well, and some of them are listed here. This includes views on voting for a $10 billion housing fund to pay for affordable housing projects across the state, as well as views on increasing taxes for the wealthiest Californians. And I would encourage you all to take a look at our survey report, crosstabs, and time trends available on our website. That concludes my presentation, but I would like to remind everyone in the audience to please submit your questions to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com, and please include your name and your organization. Thank you all for your time, and I will move on to some questions. So, looks like we have some questions rolling in. Question 1. How likely is it in the scenario in which 2 Republicans are in the top 2 slots? Great question, very relevant. Let me think about that for a second and how to approach this. So I guess as you can see in the presentation that there is no clear frontrunner in the governor's primary. But that being said, a lot has changed since our first poll in December on this race. That was showing Katie Porter with a modest lead, but today her support has dropped as more Democratic candidates had entered the race. So as of today, 2 Republicans, Steve Hilton and Chad Bianco, and 3 Democrats, Katie Porter, Eric Swalwell, and Tom Steyer, are all in a virtual tie. While I cannot say what will happen, I can say this and give you some insight on the data that we have. So we do know that the Democratic field is a lot more crowded than the Republican one, which is super noteworthy that among Republicans right now in the survey, about 7 in 10 would vote for one of the top 2 polling Republicans, so Hilton or Bianco, and only 5% of Republican voters are undecided. When looking at Democrats, who make up a plurality of voters in the state, there is varying and lower support across more candidates. So 19% would vote for Porter, 18% for Swalwell, and 14% for Steyer. But overall, 38% of Democrats would vote for someone outside of that overall top 5, and 9% are undecided. So that's really breaking up that large block of Democratic voters. And of course, independents are going to be very key to this race. While Porter leads among independents at 15%, Hilton and Swalwell are tied for second at 11%, and then followed very closely by Bianco and Steyer. But notably, about a quarter of independents say they would vote for someone outside of that top 5, and 16% are undecided. So I cannot say the exactly likelihood of the top 2 being Republican candidates, but that's still a possibility at this moment. But hopefully this gave some interesting insight into the state of the race as of today. And of course, we will continue to track this issue very closely until June, and just encourage you all to keep an eye out for future surveys. Looks like we have another question. Um, Last November, voters passed Proposition 50, which allowed redistricting. In what ways is this change affecting interest in upcoming primary elections and how are voters feeling about voting? Um, Great question. Um, let's see. So just taking a look at my crosstabs. So as of today, 68% of Californian likely voters say they're extremely or very enthusiastic about voting for Congress this year. And this is actually a bit higher than the last time we asked this specific question on voting enthusiasm. In October 2024, right before the last presidential election, only 30% of likely voters said they had that level of enthusiasm. But it's really interesting is when you look at the partisan divide. So today, 51% of Democrats are at least very enthusiastic about voting, which is the share much higher than Republicans at 31%, and only 24% of independents say they are very or extremely excited about voting. I guess in comparison, back in October 2024, 60% of Republicans were very or extremely enthusiastic about voting. So today that's 31%. So there's quite a bit of decline in that Republican morale when it comes to voting. And then across regions, likely voters in the Inland Empire, Los Angeles, and Orange County slash San Diego express higher enthusiasm than voters in the San Francisco Bay Area or the Central Valley. Notably, voter enthusiasm increases as education groups rise and income rises as well. So those are a few key differences in how different groups are feeling about voting this year. Looks like we have a few more questions. What differences do you see across the state's regions and among different demographic groups regarding views on the proposed billionaires tax that may raise state taxes for wealthy Californians? Very timely question. So we did ask this question in the context of raising taxes for the wealthiest Californians. So I just want to clarify, we did not use the language billionaires taxed. So that being said, moving on to the findings. 6 in 10 adults and likely voters do favor this idea of raising taxes for the wealthiest Californians. Additionally, majorities across regions and demographic groups favor this idea, with the support being highest among 18 to 34-year-olds, renters, and residents earning less than $40,000 a year. Across regions, San Francisco Bay Area residents and Los Angeles residents have the highest level of support at 64% each. This is followed by 6 in 10 among residents in Orange County, San Diego, and 55% each in the Central Valley and Inland Empire. And across partisan groups, 7 in 10 Republicans oppose this tax raise, while 8 in 10 Democrats and 54% of independents favor it. So, next question. Many Californians disapprove of the job ICE is doing and believe that ICE actions have made communities less safe, according to the latest survey. Has that perception influenced beliefs about the value of immigrants around the state and views on immigration? So, we actually did not ask about views of immigration or immigrants on this particular survey, but I can give you some historical context on how Californians feel about immigrants using previous statewide survey data. So, generally, Californians have a pretty positive view of immigrants. Based on our October 2025 survey, about 2 in 3 Californians said immigration is a good thing for the country, and 7 in 10 say immigrants are a benefit to the state because of their hard work and job skills. That same survey saw an ICE disapproval of 71%. And that was the first time we asked about ICE disapproval. So since then, let's see, 5 or so months ago, ICE disapproval just keeps climbing. Today it's at 77%. And support against protests against ICE actions is also quite high at over 6 in 10 Californians. So there's definitely a connection there. But I'd encourage you to keep your eyes open for future statewide surveys. Fairly certain we'll be asking about immigrants again this year at some point. So hopefully we'll be able to make better connections between these ICE and views of immigrants in future surveys. Let's see. Another question we have. About three-quarters of young Californians, renters, and those with lower incomes say they are most interested in candidates' positions on affordability and cost of living. How do these groups tend to lean in the upcoming primary? So that's a great question, because those are some of the groups with, I guess, with cost of living and affordability being the top issue among for Californians, and it's been the case for a few years now. These are some of the groups that are most impacted by this. So it is really interesting to get insight on how they're feeling in terms of our leadership. And just to give you some context about how these particular groups are feeling, 86% of likely voters who make 40K or less say their income is not keeping up with inflation. And majorities of renters and young voters are concerned about not having enough money to pay for their rent or mortgage. So these groups are a bit more impacted by the cost of living issue. Um, but I will say, even though they have higher concerns on affordability, they do not necessarily look all that different from California likely voters overall when in terms of their support for the upcoming primary. Um, Looking at this report, I would say there is no clear leader in voters of any of these groups. For those who earn under 40K, Chad Bianco leads at 14%, but there are several candidates who are earning 10% of support, including Porter, Swalwell, and Steyer, but also additionally, Antonio Verdegosa and Xavier Becerra are also earning 10% support among this group. Katie Porter is currently leading among younger voters with 14%, but is followed very closely by Steyer and then Swalwell and Bianco each at 11%. So very close race there as well. And then among renters, Porter is at 15%, followed by Steyer at 12, and Swalwell and Bianco at about 10% each. So very close races no matter where you look at these demographic breaks. What's kind of interesting is even when you look at the cross-tab of voters and how important affordability is in determining their vote, among voters who say the candidate's position on the cost of living is very important to them, Porter, Hilton, Bianco, Swalwell, and Steyer are still all in a virtual tie. So it's really it's really anyone's at this point, and these groups that are more impacted by affordability, the affordability issue, really don't look different. So kind of interesting. Let's see. Next question we have here is the survey indicates that Californians are expecting healthcare costs to go up. How does that concern reflect what people are thinking about Congress for not extending Obamacare tax credits at the end of 2025? So we did ask a question in the survey about whether or not people thought Congress did the right or wrong thing for not extending the Affordable Care Act tax credits at the end of 2025. And as I shared before, most Californians are expecting the price of their healthcare to go up for them and their families. So, relatedly, going back to that question about if they felt Congress did the right or wrong thing, 64% of both adults and likely voters believe that Congress did the wrong thing in letting these tax credits expire. And about 6 in 10 or more across all regions and demographic groups think this was the wrong decision by the US Congress. The share is highest at 71% among San Francisco Bay residents and 18 to 34-year-olds, renters, and African Americans, again, each at 71%. Um, and notably, these are also some of the groups that had the highest share of opposing the Medicaid cuts in the Big Beautiful Bill Act. So very closely related views there. But going back to the ACA tax credit, as expected, there is a large partisan divide among Californians. About 8 in 10 Democrats and 6 in 10 independents say Congress did the wrong thing. And conversely, 2 in 3 Republicans say Congress did the right thing. So there's some views there. Um, and question, next question. How has the governor's approval rating changed over the past year? What about president and the US Congress? So, um, Gavin Newsom's approval is at 51%, which is pretty much the same it was as last February. I believe it was 52% last February, so no significant change. I will say his approval hovers usually at a slim majority, and it did for most of 2025. And this is the case for both Californian adults and likely voters. Um, the state legislature has a similar approval rating as last February as well, and their approval tends to hover at slightly below half, so I would say between 44% and 44% and 50%. Um, Looking at Donald Trump, though, I will say at the start of his second term, he started his second term with 30% approval among all California adults and 33% of likely voters. And today, his overall shares are somewhat similar at 25% and have stayed similar throughout his first year in office. But I do want to note something that's interesting about Trump approval. Um, Trump approval started off low among Democrats and independents, but among Republicans, it has dropped 11 points in the last year. Although there is still a strong majority, dropping 11 points, I feel is something that is significant. Um, so I would say his slight drop in approval is kind of being driven by Republicans. Again, this is probably because approval was already low among Democrats and independents. In comparison, Newsom, the legislator, and the US Congress did not see a party move as strongly in any direction over the last year. And that being said, US Congress approval is low and has been low for the last year at 20% or less among both California adults and likely voters. So I believe that was the last question we have right now. Um, so thank you all for listening to me talk for almost 30 minutes. I hope you found this really interesting. And again, please take a look at our report, crosstabs, and time trends available on our website. And hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you.